Hello, hello. This is Flipped Notes 1.3 of Scientific Foundations of Psych. And in this section, I'm going to be going over a little bit more the perspectives of psychology, the different domains and the different career fields in psychology. So let's get to it. Our targets are, again, to look at contributions of major figures or people in psych, look at the different theoretical approaches and their limitations, and then to be able to distinguish the different domains of psych. All right, so here are our major perspectives. When we're in class, I've got some mnemonics and some other activities we're going to do, but these are something that we will be applying all year long. So they're different ways to explain behavior, perspectives, points of view. So for example, with all of these, we could be talking about a mental illness. We might not be, but we could be. Let's say we're talking about depression. That these are all different perspectives or ways we could explain why a person might struggle with depression. So here are our theoretical approaches in no particular order. The first is biological or neuroscience, which focuses on understanding how the brain and the body creates our thoughts, emotions, and memories. So looking for a truly physiological explanation. So they might ask, how are messages transmitted throughout the body? How is blood chemistry linked to our motives? The next is the evolutionary perspective. Looks at how the natural selection process has caused behavior or genes to develop and adapt. How does evolution influence behavior and tendencies? Now, when I say evolution in here, in psych, we're not talking about evolution of people from apes. We're really more talking about the evolution of early humans to modern humans. That how have people who lived and maybe lived outside all the time and depended on basically just whatever was available to them in nature, how have they evolved to modern people who live in homes and face the stressors of the everyday world? That's kind of the evolutionary perspective we're looking at in psychology. Behavior genetics, how much our genes and environmental influence individual differences. So this is a lot of the nature versus nurture. What extent is nature nurture on impact our personality, mental disorders? The psychoanalytic, also called the psychodynamic perspective, which is associated with Sigmund Freud, is all about the unconscious mind as the director of behavior. How does the energy from the unconscious motivate our actions? The behavioral perspective, which we talked about with John Watson as the founder and B.F. Skinner. How is our behavior shaped by the learning process? How did we learn to be afraid? What did we maybe learn about how people respond that maybe leads to our depression or a person's depression? How do we learn to fear particular objects? How can we change behaviors? The cognitive perspective we mentioned with Jean Piaget, which is all about thinking, how we take in, store, and retrieve information, our perceptions, how they influence actions. How does our interpretation of something impact behavior? The humanistic perspective with Abraham Maslow, which remember that was developed in contrast of what was considered the dehumanizing earlier perspectives, emphasizes human growth potential as well as the self-concept. How can I be my best self? And then social cultural or sociocultural perspective. Human behavior must be interpreted in proper social and cultural contexts, that different environments, social settings, create different behaviors. How are various ethnic groups alike different? How are social influences different across different cultures? So there are 7 themes throughout psychology, and we will use these all throughout the year. The first, we've mentioned this word before, psychology is empirical, which means that it uses scientific research, and that'll be the second half of this unit. The next is that it's theoretically diverse, that there are a lot of competing theories. So when we're talking about something like depression, we can explain it a lot of ways, that maybe there's a chemical imbalance in the brain that's biological, that maybe they inherited it, that could be part of behavior genetics, that maybe they observed others who experience depressive behaviors and they are modeling that, or maybe they've been rewarded for kind of be exhibiting depressive behaviors by getting more attention from people saying, are you okay? So that's kind of a behaviorist perspective. Or is there an evolutionary explanation for depression? So there's all kinds of theories, and sometimes they are contrasting to explain behavior. So we can say that psychology is eclectic. The word eclectic means that it comes from a broad range of sources. So, for example, if you have an eclectic taste in music, it means you like a lot of different types of music. So, by saying psychology's theories are eclectic, it means that there are a lot of different ways we could explain a specific behavior. Psychology evolves in a socio-historical context. It's influenced by trends and issues. So really kind of what is getting a lot of research has a lot to do with what is going on in the world. So right now, there's going to be a lot of new studies about social behavior related to the pandemic. Historically, there have been growing to be more studies about sexuality, about what influences your desire for a partner of the same gender or a different gender, that's something that people are interested in. One of the biggest areas for research is child development, because people always want to know about what's the best way to raise children. But whatever is kind of big in history and society, that tends to influence psychology as well. The next one, behavior is determined by multiple causes. So again, that goes with the multiple theories. It's shaped by cultural heritage that, again, like your society, influences behavior. It's jointly influenced by heredity and environment. Again, that's that nature nurture. And that people's experience of the world is highly subjective. It's based on their own opinions. So it's hard to explain which is the best theory to describe a behavior or explain a behavior because it is still subjective. All right, some of the domains or areas in which research can be done. We have basic research versus applied research. So basic research is they're actually just doing the studying of things. So we have biological, which looks for the connection between the mind and the body, specifically the brain, but it can also be genes. Developmental studies how behavior and mental processes change over the lifespan, and these will all be separate units that we learn about throughout the year. So how we develop from being in the womb to a child, an adolescent, a teen, an adult, all the way up until our elderly years. Cognitive research, how we perceive, think, and solve problems. This has a lot to do with memory and what are the best ways to learn. That's part of cognitive research. Personality, our persistent traits. Social, how people influence one another. And then psychometric is with how we actually can measure these things in a psychological sense, like through research, experiments, surveys, body measurement, like measuring brain waves and chemicals in the brain. All of that is part of psychometrics. Then applied research is when we take information that we gained from research in those other categories, and then we're actually able to apply it to the real world. Industrial organization psychology is when we're taking research and applying it to the workplace. So for example, if we learn about the effect of working by yourself versus working in groups, then we apply that to a factory. Should these factory workers be working by themselves or in pods? Do they work better or do they get distracted more? So it would be the basic research, and then the industrial organization psychologist would apply it to the real world. A clinical psychologist, they are the ones who actually do the assessment and treatment of individuals with mental illness. So we will talk about that when we get to the treatment unit, which is actually pretty late in our course. Educational psychologist has expertise about teaching and learning. So educational psychologists are getting their workout right now, figuring out what is the best way to help virtual learners learn. Counseling psychologists, they help people cope with academic, other challenges, marital, family challenges. And then positive psychology is a new growing field that focuses on how positive events and a positive mindset can affect life. I'm going to do a quick run through of psychology as a profession. Psychologists in general are trained to observe, analyze, and evaluate behavior. To be an actual psychologist, you generally need a doctorate degree or a PhD in psych. So that would be bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD. And they can work in various subfields, and some of them may treat disorders. A psychiatrist, on the other hand, completes medical school. So they're going to get their bachelor's degree, then they have to apply to and be accepted into a medical school. And then once they complete their medical certification, their MD, they can specialize in psychiatric medicine. So kind of like how a cardiologist would become a general medical doctor. They spend their 4 years in med school first, then they take additional training to study the heart. Well, a psychiatrist would go beyond and take additional training to study behavior and the mind. The big difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is that a psychiatrist can prescribe medication. A clinical psychologist is going to kind of do some of the same things. They are still going to diagnose and treat people with emotional disturbances the way a psychiatrist would. We consider them therapists. They work in private practices, mental hospitals, prisons, clinics, a wide variety of settings. Of all psychologists, half are clinical psychologists, the type that actually treat people with mental illnesses. So again, here in the professions, this is probably the key thing you need to know. So clinical psychologist gets a PhD, and they're going to treat people through psychotherapy by getting people to change their cognition patterns, change the way they think, change the way they behave. A psychiatrist will still do that. They're going to treat psychotherapy with behavior changes, but they can also do it through medication, through psychopharmacological methods. So only a psychiatrist or any other kind of medical doctor can prescribe medication. All right, some other types of psychological professions. The counseling psychologist, you may be pretty familiar with because we have them at our own school. They help people with everyday life problems. Frequently, they will have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and then they will get a professional license, or an LPC, which means licensed professional counselor. A developmental psychologist works more with research. They're studying physical, emotional changes all throughout life. They are doing the research that can be applied to schools, applied to behaviors. Educational psychology looks at teaching methods, how students learn. Again, this is research. Community psychologists will often work in public health, mental health, or social welfare agencies. They're extremely important because a lot of times they may be providing group support. Unfortunately, this is probably an area where there's a really high need, but the reason the need is so high and not filled is because they tend to not make very much money, because often they're government funded and kind of lower on the totem pole as far as where government funding goes, but very important. Industrial organizational psychologists, as mentioned earlier, they're taking those theories about the workplace, or about psychology, and applying them to the workplace. And often they work in the human resource office of an organization, including schools. We have a human resource department, but any kind of business. And they might apply theories of psychology to find people who have a personality that will match a certain business, or how to motivate employees, how to get them to be the most productive and efficient employees. So this is one area where you could be using a psychology degree, but not working with people who have any kind of mental illness, not working in any kind of like healthcare at all, but rather you would be taking psychology and applying it to a workplace. Sometimes this field can make quite a bit of money depending on what kind of organization or industrial group you might work for. A psychobiologist, kind of what it sounds like, incorporating the biology side into psychology, so studying things like the effects of drugs or medications on the brain. Uses a lot of the new technology to research how to treat things from a physiological point of view. A forensic psychologist can help police develop personality profiles of criminals. A lot of people are interested in this because of popular TV shows like Psych and CSI. And while it is definitely like a real field of psychology, it's often not as fast as things are portrayed, and not quite as exciting in that they're, on these TV shows, there's like a new serial killer case like every episode. It's not quite like that there. But they are still using psychology to help in the criminal justice system. Experimental psychologists are primarily working through universities, doing research through there, but there are also lots of other places that are not affiliated with universities that do experiments in psychology. but they're providing a lot of the real research for psychology. So I got some graphs here real quick to show, where the majority of people work. And we've talked about when it comes to specialties in psychology, that the majority of psychologists are clinical, with quite a few in counseling, then educational psychologists. As far as what are they doing research about, it looks like the biggest research here is in developmental. We're talking about what children are like all through the lifespan, though, not just children, but teens, elderly as well. The next biggest is about social psychology. So like behaviors during the pandemic would fall under that. A lot of physiological, so that's kind of the neuroscience, general experimental, and a lot of other. Where would you find psychologists? Where are they employed? The majority in private practice, so those would be the clinical psychologists. Quite a few through colleges and universities, so both as counseling psychologists, but also as research psychologists, and then also hospitals and clinics. The APA, we mentioned this in another section, but a little more detail here, is the American Psychological Association. So this is really kind of what leads the U.S. and really kind of leads the world as well in the whole field of psychology. So it's a professional organization that looks at the scientific standards for psychology. Originally started at Clark University in Massachusetts. We know G. Stanley Hall as the psychologist who established the first psych lab in America. And he also helped to establish the APA and was the first president of the APA. And then we also mentioned Mary Woodin Calkins as the first female president of the APA. That is it for Flipped Notes 1.3.